Greetings, dear friends. I present to your attention the most common malfunctions and breakdowns that occur on the Mercedes-Benz Vito. Like the brakes, the suspension also combines commercial reliability with light handling. Compared to the Vito, the Volkswagen T4 feels like a truck. Nevertheless, there are powerful levers, resource and heavy load shock absorbers and springs, and completely replaceable silent blocks. True, the ball of the front lever, although riveted to the lever, is not in the original spare parts from Mercedes. Everything is so solidly made that the suspension, especially the rear on the diagonal arms, can last longer than the attachments to the body, which are desperately corroded. A self-leveling rear axle air suspension was offered as an option on the Vito and as standard on the V-Class. Two air bellows, compressor, level sensor, dryer, and valve. By design, it seems to be similar to the newer air suspensions of passenger cars, but Vito's resource is much higher. With runs of more than 300,000, air bellows, wiring, body position sensors or their thrust, and system dryer are usually changed. All of this is relatively inexpensive. What is expensive is the compressor. It costs about 1200 euros for the original or 600 for the analog. The design is quite classical. The rack and pinion mechanism and the amplifier is hydraulic. In the system, it's advisable to regularly change the oil, otherwise the pump will begin to buzz predictably. You need to change it together with the filter in the tank. With high mileage, and Vito has them almost always large, wear of the spool mechanism and leakage of hydraulic lines are also likely. At the same time, the rail is so strong that it may be well native. Since the cars are strictly front-wheel drive, the Mercedes produced them in the 90s, then from a mechanical point of view everything is fine. The drives do not rust, the splines do not chip, the CV joints run for a long time as long as there are anthers and grease. And all this despite the fact that this is the first experience of the company in the production of transmissions for a layout with turn-zero power unit. The 5-speed manual gearbox on the Vito is very reliable, as it should be, but the shifting system with cables and a complex selection mechanism turned out to be a weak point. First of all, the linkage of the mechanism itself wears out. The plastic U-shaped washer slider wears out along the working surface, and its plastic shell cracks under excessive loads. Ball joints all wear out, both the balls of the cables and the ball of the slider. And with wheel runs over 500,000, even the rolling axles of the lever wear out. There is another slider in the design of the box. This is a cube in the switching mechanism already on the box itself. It's plastic and wears out in just a couple of years. Many people sharpen fluorous plastic or bronze ones to replace them, but in dusty conditions this doesn't help for a long time. The wear of axles of the rocker mechanism and the balancer bushings requires regular attention from the owner. Poor inclusion of revers and second gears, not inclusion of fifths, these are all drive problems. But they can also lead to breakdowns of the mechanical part of the box. First of all, the fifth gear suffers. The mileage on it is maximum. The failure to engage leads to an overload of the clutch, wear of the forks, and the fifth gear itself. After 1997, the automatic transmission ZF4HP20 appeared on the car. Only 4 stages, but electronic control of blockings and pressure, torque limit of about 330 nanometers, and a very successful design. By and large, the box has no major weaknesses. With a regular oil change at least once every 60,000, a torque converter with replacement of bushings and blocking linings and linear solenoids will require repair by 250-300,000 run. If the planned repairs are not done, the oil is not changed, and besides you drive actively, then this automatic transmission can also be broken. Overheating and dirty oil lead to premature failure of pistons and solenoids. It's also the culprit of early failure of the rolling bearings of the caliper and drive gear, as well as the caliper itself. The bushing of the oil pump and its cover also wear out. They do not change normally, so either a machine park and skilled hands or a complete replacement will help. The price is rather big. The kit costs about 350 euros, which is more than the assembled box while still alive. The moment from powerful diesel engines, if they are in the standard version, the box digests calmly. But if you get carried away with chip tuning and there are amateurs and raise the torque, say to 350 nanometers, then when slipping there is a risk of breaking the input shaft at the junction with the drum. The peculiarities of the layout of the motors under the hood force the manufacturer to use a radiator with a built-in expansion tank and arrange the units very tightly. Large-scale maintenance is usually accompanied by the removal of the front panel and radiators, and to access the solar turbine rods and to turbine itself, quite often they simply saw through a window in the body, at the feet of the passenger. This allows you to change Chinese turbines in just 15 minutes, which is important for those who operate a car in the just drive style. In general, not the worst life hack, but it says a lot about the attitude towards repairs, because servicing on a lift is a little more difficult and longer. On most gasoline Vitos, engines of the M111 families with VDO Siemens injection were installed before restyling, and M111 Evo with HFM injection after. The volume is 2.0 and 2.3 liters, the power is 129 and 143 horsepower. The forces in this commercial performance are less than on the passenger versions, but there is a little more torque. The main problem with any M111 is age, but the reliability of the design is amazing. It is quite possible that it hasn't yet capitalized with a run of 500 plus, but this is not certain. The state of the piston group directly depends on the operation of auxiliary systems and maintenance. In addition to regular oiling changes, it is worth paying attention to the crankcase ventilation system, the tightness of the intake and the ignition system. Oil leaks on the M111 usually indicate that the engine was not engaged. They didn't wash the oil separator, didn't change the pipes and valves, didn't monitor the integrity of the pipes. Another common misfortune lurks in the brains of the PMS. The absolute pressure sensor is an unpretentious thing, and the suppliers of brains carried it into the control unit, connecting it to the intake manifold with a long tube. Hence, there are two nuances of the operation of M111 motors with such a control system at once. The sensor itself dies in the control unit. It needs to be resoldered, opening the unit, which not all specialists can do. By the way, the VDO unit is considered less reliable than Bosch, but they are interchangeable, so you can come across any option. And the tube must be installed sufficiently elastic, oil and petrol resistant. System failures due to its collapse and degradation when fuel and oil vapors get into it. The modernization of 1999 made the M111 engine stronger mechanically and more economical by increasing the compression ratio, improving the operation of the control system, increasing the strength of the block, crankshaft and connecting rods. However, the atmospheric version of the engine does not really need all this. But the HFM injection system with a thin film DMRV turned out to be more capricious just because of this sensor. They completely abandoned the absolute pressure sensor and tied up all the work of the motor on the DMRV. As a result, the motor depends very much on the quality of its operation. But the system is better diagnosed and engine has lower fuel consumption and better dynamics. If you do not regret the money for the original DMRV, or you have read how and which insert from the Bosch DMRV VAS can be put instead of the original, then this is a great option. But installing new Chinese ones is obviously a road to nowhere. They may not work right away, but most likely they will work in the range for a short time, about 6 months after greatly increasing the reaction time and deviation. The option wash and put back the original is also poorly suited. A thin film channel is afraid of moisture-containing liquids, many solvents, and besides, when a liquid is supplied under pressure, the chances of damaging the films are almost 100%. Opening a sensor for washing is fraught with many risks, but there is a good news. Using an oscilloscope in a warm room, you can quite accurately check the status of the sensor by the signal level and its fluctuations. Another trouble with the wiring of the HFM units, for some reason it endures the hardships of service worse. It is especially unpleasant that the wiring on the DPKV breaks down and the masses rot away, after which the number of systems failures grows like an avalanche. PMS is much less dependent on wiring, and the wiring is better there, especially in the Bosch version, but Vito doesn't have this. Volkswagen's 2.8-liter VR6 12-valve engine come under the hood of the Vito by some miracle. Since the manufacturers are still competitors, the technology exchange has not been like them, since Volkswagen took over the Audi from Mercedes, along with a bunch of new developments. This is not the simplest motor and interesting in its own way. Let me remind you that a camber angle of 15 degrees makes it possible for a V-shaped engine to get by with one common cylinder head and one solid block. But the presence of a camber allows you to greatly reduce the dimensions of the motor in all directions. In length, it is like a 4-cylinder, and in width is slightly larger. In the Volkswagen version, the main drawback of engines of this generation is the relatively high mass and not very reliable timing, located on the flywheel side and requiring the removal of the motor box for replacement. Specifically, in the 12-valve version, the power is not so high, but there is a lot of traction, which is very useful for a minibus. Diesel engines on Vito were installed in two families: old school 8-valve OM601 and more modern 16-valve OM611 after restyling. Moreover, OM601 in the 78 horsepower version. It has no turbine, so it is a non-rotating diesel without torque at the bottom, with which you will have to use all the reserves of patience with each trip. But from the point of view of reliability, everything is not bad there. The OM601D23 range used on Vito is a pre-chamber diesel engine. The post-injection pump is mechanical with a centrifugal advanced automatic. The injectors are also Bosch. The 98 power version has a turbine and with oil cooling, very primitive and not particularly resourceful. Despite the initially laid down very high resource, there are still enough problems on cars aged 20-25 years. There is a catification of injectors, cracks in spray nozzles, catification of pre-chambers and repeatedly torn off fasteners, and current and well-groomed hydraulics of the fuel system and wear of piston groups, and timing slip and even cylinder head corrosion, which is surprisingly common. Turbines are often not original, and this is good, the case when tuning is beneficial. Naturally, aspirated motors 78 forces are theoretically more reliable than supercharged ones, but in fact it all depends on the quality of service. The main weak points are perhaps precisely the corrosion and sticking of injectors and pre-chambers during repairs, as well as the injector timing machine. If everything really bad, then a major overhaul doesn't make much sense, except from a great love for old-school structures. Usually, if the OM601 still managed to ruin completely, they change it to something more modern. The engines of the OM611 family, which appeared on cars after restyling, are all strictly turbocharged, even the weakest. This means that cars with them are quite high torque and much more pleasant on the go, even with low power. The injection here is electronic common rail. The CP1 injection pump is simpler and more reliable. It's easy to repair. The turbines are modern and resourceful, direct injection, which means that the operating range is wider and the engine picks up speed better. At the same time, the mechanical part is just as strong, which means that the operating range is wider and engine picks up speed better. At the same time, the mechanical part is just as strong. There are also weak points, for example, breakdowns of flaps in the intake manifold and heat-resistant washers of injectors and glow plugs stuck tightly. If you do not remove the injectors regularly, at least once every 50,000 kilometers, then the next repair may end up with an injector thrown into a landfill or even a cylinder head cover. With runs of more than 300,000, crankshaft seizures occur due to insufficient oil pressure. The motor requires regular monitoring of oil pressure, the condition of the oil pump, the oil intake, and the use of 5W50 or 10W60 oils in the hot summer, especially if the car with a manual gearbox also drives with a full load or even with a trailer. The automatic gearbox usually doesn't allow prolonged driving at low revolutions with high load. When buying, measuring the oil pressure is required. The knock of the diesel engine well hides the sounds of the rotated root liner in the initial stage. For minor troubles, the branch pipe between the turbine and the intercooler burst, the fuel rail requires maintenance of the pressure regulator, the vacuum of the turbine control system and their geometry on the most powerful version is broken, the fuel system is easily airborne, while the nozzles here are most sensitive to the state of filters and diesel fuel. This information about the problems of Mercedes-Benz Vito is exhausted. If you know more or disagree with what you heard, I'm waiting for you in the comments.